Last Friday's deadly Paris attacks are dominating the agenda at global summits, from the recently concluded G20 meeting in Turkey to the APEC summit in the Philippines. One group took center stage, Islamic State. The gathering of the world's 20 major economies was supposed to focus on global economic concerns, but the Paris attacks changed that narrative, with G20 leaders, including Russian President Vladimir Putin and his US counterpart Barack Obama, discussing a unified strategy against ISIL. From the downing of a Russian airliner to the killing spree in Paris, the terrorist group has carried out attacks on 3 continents. Can an international forum like the G20 be a platform to launch an anti-ISIL campaign? Joining me from Bangkok is Pepe Escobar. He is the correspondent for Asia Times, and from Paris, economist Philippe Du Fresnay. From Beijing, Liu Youfa. He is the former vice president of the China Institute of International Studies. And in the studio with me, Yenal Kucuker, senior Turkey expert at the Turkish Heritage Organization. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Yenal, let me start with you. This summit, as we've just heard, was overshadowed to a large extent by the attacks in Paris. Did you hear anything that came out of this summit that tells us how the G20 as a group would respond to terrorism?
Yes, the G20 summit initially was supposed to be an economic summit, but the events that took place in Paris actually changed that, obviously. And when leaders came to Antalya for the summit, they had one thing in their mind, and that was the terrorism, ISIL. Turkey has been grappling with terrorism for a long time now, and having been born and lived in Turkey, I experienced terrorism events myself, and so Turkey is no stranger to terrorism. So when Turkey was hosting the G20 summit, President Erdogan's he had only one thing in his agenda, and that was how to combat against terrorism as G20 summit. Unified agenda. So when all the leaders gathered in, and he had in his opening remarks, he mentioned about the importance of unified force against the ISIL and what they should do. And because it started hitting, ISIL was not contained within the borders of Syria or Iraq anymore. Now it was impacting Europe, and people were concerned, leaders were concerned that next would be perhaps America or some other countries. As a result, I think the only thing that came out of the G20, as far as I'm concerned, is that they definitely have to confront ISIL where it belongs, basically in Syria and Iraq.
Philippe, the French have responded to the attacks by conducting bombing raids on Islamic State targets in Syria. Of course, in France itself, they declared a state of emergency. That's just been extended to 3 months, and there is something of a security lockdown in the country as well. Would the French be satisfied with the response they heard from their G20 partners on how they tackle a group like Islamic State and how they take on terrorism?
Well, first, thank you for having me. As you say, this is a very serious situation right now in France, but the president is said to have taken measures immediately, effective measures that happen to satisfy the French people, as far as I know. The Congress was reunified in Versailles 2 days ago, and they made a significant series of decisions that have been majorly approved. On the French territory, as you said, there were a lot of perquisitions leading to the death of the leader of the assaults. He was killed yesterday in the town of Saint-Denis. He was tracked down and found in the town of Saint-Denis, and he died fighting with the policemen. The reaction from the G20, which condemned these assaults, was very well appreciated in France, but the French people are still working on the measures to retaliate against the Daesh. For example, on my way here, I crossed the official delegation of François Hollande, who was on his way to the very new French Pentagon, what we call the French Pentagon, in Balard, because he's going to have a defense council in 1 hour from now.
Youfa, China itself has been the victim of terrorism on more than one occasion. How does Beijing view what has taken place in Paris, and what did Chinese leaders bring to the summit in Turkey on how they would tackle this problem globally?
Well, I think Chinese President Mr. Xi Jinping and the Prime Minister Mr. Li Keqiang have both issued the statements in this regard. To my understanding, no country is too far away from the attacks from the ISILs. This is the sore for the whole human life and humanity, to speak broadly. Chinese government, as Chinese president indicated, is ready to join hands with the international community to fight against the ISIL activities, because it is no longer containing its activities in the Middle East. It's spreading its activities to 3 continents, as the anchor mentioned a minute ago. So it has become a global issue, which needs the immediate and urgent collective efforts by the countries concerned.
Pepe, do you think the leaders at the G20 countries showed unity on how they will tackle a group like Islamic State and indeed the Syria crisis as a whole? Or did you detect that there were significant differences on the approach to tackling this problem?
In fact, we're going to see it starting from now, because we have the rumblings of, I would say, a really efficient East and West coalition against ISIS. This means that what the Russians had been doing for over 5 weeks now, which was to bomb heavily all sorts of Salafi jihadism in Syria, not only ISIS. Now they're going to be joined by the French at the highest level. Military commanders, Russian and French, are already coordinating a Russian-French strategy. The Americans finally woke up at the G20, that famous 35-minute conversation between Putin and Obama on the sidelines of G20. That was graphic. Finally, Obama sat down with Putin, and Putin had to explain to Obama all over again the Russian strategy, which is what the Russians had been doing for months now, proposing this to the Westerners and now actually doing on the terrain. The problem is what happens on the ground. It's impossible to have a shock and awe ground invasion of Syria and Iraq by the US, by the Pentagon, by NATO, whatever. You have to use the forces that you have on the ground, and these are the Kurds. The problem is we have 3 different, at least 2 different, very separate Kurd, let's say, offensives. One is the Kurdish Peshmerga from northern Iraq, and the other one, the Syrian Kurds, YPG, helped by PKK. The problem is Turkey doesn't want to help them or work together with Syrian Kurds. The Americans have to convince Turkey that now it's a coalition of everybody against Daesh. Because what they did in Paris, and it could be reproduced in Rome, in London, or in New York as they threatened, is very much real. And strategically, it may be folly, but Daesh is a mix of very organized militia and an apocalyptic cult. So they want to bring all foreign powers, big foreign powers, to the terrain in Iraq and provoke an apocalyptic war. So this is completely crazy. It has to be fought with intelligence on the ground, right, and with force on the ground that know how to fight. So we have to rely on the Kurds.
You know, Pepe raises an interesting point there. I mean, Turkey is in a conflict itself with the Kurdish minority in the country, many of whom are looking for an independent state. How does that complicate the situation? How does that complicate the fight against ISIL?
Very much so. It's not easy. Turkey borders Iraq, Syria, Iran, and so as a result, that neighborhood, things are very complicated in terms of Turkey's neighborhood. And Turkey started with 0 issues with its neighbors, but it ended up being somewhat difficult. The complication arises from the history that goes back to 30 years in PKK. Again, the insurgency that has been going on for 30 years, which was in a ceasefire up until just summer, actually. And once PKK started...
Now, the PKK is the main Kurdish
organization
fighting for independence.
Correct. Right. Fighting for independence for over 30 years. And there was a recent ceasefire that lasted about 2.5 years. Again, that was initiated by, at the time, Prime Minister Erdogan. But things have changed, and PKK reignited the fight. Again, there was a bombing in Ankara. There were many attacks. In a matter of about a month or so, more than 100 people were killed in Turkey as a result of PKK attacks. So that really complicates Turkey's position when it comes to Syrian relations, ISIS. So Turkey is concerned that if these groups that that was mentioned before, YPG, Peshmerga, and PKK, Turkish administration sees that they don't look at them as any different than basically ISIL. They consider them all part of that because you're fighting a group with another group. And some scholars, for example, the Kurdish scholars are indicating that here in America, that it's not the way to fight, that you can't rely on mercenaries basically to do your own work. And I agree with that because I think that's a complicated situation. Yes, we have to rely. It looks like Kurds are the only reliable force, but at the same time, they should not be owned by themselves. We cannot, United States and all the coalition governments
Would it be fair to say that not everybody is on the same side here?
No, not everybody's on the same side. They all have their geopolitical alignments,
right.
And it's going to be fairly difficult to find that alignment.
Okay, let me ask you about this. I mean, as you point out, Turkey is in a very rough neighborhood. It is now playing host to hundreds of thousands of refugees who are fleeing that war in Syria. One of the aims of this G20 meeting was to address that crisis, not just in Turkey, but in Europe as well. Did the leaders make any progress on that?
Somewhat, yes. Well, now, again, Turkey is hosting more than 2.2 million refugees and spent more than almost $8 billion US. That's 8 billion, not million. That's a lot of money to spend within the past 5 years, and Turkey keeps getting all these refugees. Not even once Turkey complained about not accepting any refugees, and they continue to do so. I'd like to add this, again, having been born and raised in Turkey, I remember the days when the Balkan Wars were going on in Bosnia, and all these Bosnian refugees came to Turkey, my hometown, actually. So Turkey, because of that neighborhood, is very familiar. And prior to that, with the Iraq War, accepted thousands of Iraqi refugees that settled in Turkey, different parts of Turkey. So Turkey is extremely familiar, and they treated them really well. They continue to do so. Right. But at the same time, they cannot continue to do this. Angela Merkel, right before the elections in Turkey, came to Turkey and met with President, and they discussed how to handle this refugee. And one of the goals was basically to provide more funding to Turkey. But Turkey indicated that it's not just funding. They need to have other types of legislation to ease their work.
Let me go to Philippe in Paris on this particular issue. Philippe, has Europe's attitude changed in some way in the wake of the attacks in Paris on how to handle the Syrian refugee situation?
Well, of course, it's a very complicated issue. You know that one of the assailants, one who was killed in the Bataclan slaughter, had actually a Syrian passport. However, the message here, the general message here, is not to give in to hatred, not to do any amalgam. We're well aware of the difference between refugees and just a few terrorists that would use this way to get back in France. But to get back to what you were talking about, the G20 condemned in a general fashion the attempts, the terrorism and the terrorist acts. But from the French point of view, even though we are very grateful to see this general movement, it's very hard to see the G20 right now, these very days. We keep on talking about these events, considering that yesterday we found out, or the police found out, that there was another plot that was planned to happen in La Défense, in the business area of Paris. So we are still very much thinking about it. The new measures are being taken, not only regarding the control at the borders, which is also referred to during the G20 communique, but also the fact that François Hollande just announced that there would be hiring another 8,500 policemen, people working for justice, and also with the creation of a national guard based on reservists. I can tell you that at my humble level, I already applied as a reservist officer just to try and help sort out this situation.